I'd like to introduce Newcastle Law School. I'm the Dean of Newcastle Law School, and it is a wonderful law school to work in. I would say that I fundamentally reject the notion put by Glenn Davis that all universities in the public sector are fundamentally similar. And I think that there is a great diversity, and I want to talk a little bit about that diversity in terms of the universities as well as the law schools within Australia. So in the context of our law school, we think about diversity in a whole range of ways, and I want to perhaps touch on some of the matters where we're distinctly different, I think, from other law schools, and how we deal with that difference and how we encourage very diverse thought throughout the law school. I think one matter which is fundamentally different is that we have the largest proportion of Indigenous Australians in our law school across Australia as a percentage. We take in about 200 students per year, which is markedly less than some of the big law schools. I think Mary was saying it's close to 700 per year at Sydney University, which seems to me to be an enormous number to take in for a law school. I hope I'm not causing offence. But of our student population, about 8% of our commencing students this year are Indigenous students. We also take in a very high proportion of students who are first in family to go to university. And last year in our graduating student population, 76% of our students were first in family, which I think would be the highest proportion within Australia if I had the figures from other law schools. I think in other law schools they're probably looking at percentage figures that are closer to the 10 or 15%, if that, in terms of first in family. So we are fundamentally different in lots of ways. We also take in a much higher proportion, of course, of regional and remote Australians. Our university services a very large population. It takes in a lot of country students, and it has a very large hinterland. So just to put it into context, Newcastle is Australia's 7th largest city. It has around 350,000 people within the immediate city area and more than 1 million people in its hinterland. If we extend that onto the Central Coast, it has a far bigger population and reach. However, it also reaches and extends, and of course we take students from Maitland and beyond and from many country and rural areas. We tend to have a much higher sort of proportion of students in the lower socio-economic range. And we have a very tiny proportion of international students in our law school. It is around 1%. We have 1 or 2 international students per year. We have a significantly high proportion of students with a disability, and that's because part of the university mission is around access, around promoting equity, as well as excellence in terms of education. So I thought it might be useful just to give you some statistics, because that's always helpful, and because I'm a bit of an empiricist, to tell you about the current profile of solicitors in New South Wales, and to give you a sense about where our law students end up and why they're a little different perhaps from others. There are 30,000 practising lawyers currently in Australia and 71,000 around Australia. In terms of the proportion, it's now about equal 50-50 in terms of male and female lawyers. That's a significant change from 20 years ago when the numbers was considerably different. And 30 years ago when I was first admitted to practice, the numbers were again considerably different. The number of Indigenous solicitors practising in New South Wales remains quite small, only 120, and I can tell you that a number of them come from my university. And as I see them graduate each year, they actually have a special sash that shows that they are the Indigenous graduates. And although I didn't count the numbers last year, I know that at the second graduation ceremony last year, there were at least 8 students who were graduating, and in the first one, probably even more. In terms of the 39 law schools in the 2015 study, and it has increased slightly since that study was taken, the total number of Australian law graduates was 7,583. So that's per year who are coming out. I've just done an updated study for the Council of Australian Law Deans to find out what the number is now. But it's not the number that the Financial Review has often suggested, which is around 16,000 per year. It's a far smaller number. Whether that number changes because of these increased enrolments at some universities is an interesting question to pursue. So 42 universities in Australia now offer a law degree. In terms of gender diversity, the last large-scale study that was done in terms of student profile showed that 63% were female and 37% were male. So that's quite a difference over the years. We're now graduating many more females than at any point in the past. And there seems to be a preference, if you like, of female students to undertake law. In terms of the graduates in Australia, only 1% identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island in the study that was done last year. And as you can see, we're taking in more than 8% per year, so many of those are actually coming from Newcastle. There are some significant issues with some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Often it's a retention rate issue in that they may actually start law but not finish law. So we do a lot of work in terms of our retention rate and attempting to improve the retention rate. In 1990, which wasn't that long ago, only 50 undergraduate students across all of Australia recognised themselves as being Indigenous. In terms of country of birth, it's quite interesting. A large proportion of students, generally in terms of who studies law, are born in Australia, and 22% are born overseas. That's slightly different to the national statistics that you find. You know, we often hear 49% born overseas or first generation Australian. It's probably not all that different in terms of law graduates, but I'd like to suggest that you get a smaller number who are, if you like, first generation Australian or born overseas. That's partly sometimes to do with the requirement, I think, to have very high English level skills to study law, but there may be other factors at play as well. And you can also see that there you've got the proportion of parents' highest level of education, which is markedly different from what we have in Newcastle, where 76% of students are the first in the family to progress to university. In my view, diversity in law means lots of different things, and it's really critical that we attract students from a very wide proportion of the population and that we reflect what we think are the needs in terms of the professional background. And it's as a result of that that we have an early entry Indigenous scheme for students. We also really do want to ensure that there is diversity of thought within the law school. So we have, subjects like law and religion subject, but we also do a lot more than that, and that's because of the demographics of our region. If you go to Newcastle, as Mary has, and you visit it, you'll actually notice that there are very few overseas-born people in Newcastle, and in fact the demographic is quite different from that in Sydney. My Chinese member of staff very proudly told me that there were about 600 Chinese people in Newcastle. Imagine that in the context of Sydney. And I think Ben probably knows a number of them. It's a very small Chinese community. And the other communities that are there who are sort of overseas communities are similarly quite small. I think the business school probably has more Chinese students than there are Chinese people within Newcastle, which is fascinating to consider. But because of that lack of diversity, if you like, within the community, which is so different from really the very diverse community in Sydney, we have to do a great deal more with our students so that they actually understand the diverse population that exists within Australia, and we prepare them, if you like, for different communities and different experiences. And so each year we run at least 8 overseas courses, and they're overseas courses which are clinical. So we're a clinical law school, which means, and I think Australia's leading clinical law school, I don't just think that, I think others say that as well, which means that our students start having a clinical experience from the moment they start at the law school, and their last 2 years are spent in clinic and in placement, which is bound up with their education. That means that they're actually helping people on a pro bono basis within the Newcastle area, but also beyond. So some of them are placed with Aboriginal communities, some of them are placed with a range of different pro bono service providers, and they also get placed with local solicitors after they've done about 180 hours of work in our legal clinic. But to actually give them an overseas experience and to introduce them to different societies, we run 8 overseas clinical programs per year, which takes about half of our cohort. Not all of them will get an overseas experience with us, simply because we just can't afford it or manage it, but about half will. And they go to places like Myanmar, where we've run some great, I think, barefoot law services, which are very much directed at the refugee issues that are existing in Myanmar and the surrounding countries. Very challenging for our students when we last ran the Myanmar project. We work in Cambodia. This week we have students working in Cook Islands on justice and legislative reform. We'll have students going to Japan very soon, Indonesia next week. So our students are travelling to places and having an in-depth 3 or 4 week experience where they're working often with lawyers and students on the ground on real social problems. And so that's important for us because it provides our students with, I think, a way of thinking about the world which really reshapes their identity. We know that it does because we've done survey work on them, both after they've done the experience and 4 or 5 years on, about the impact that it's had. And my voice is beginning to go a bit, so I'll talk softly. One of the major factors that I think is really important in the context of regional communities is that we actually make law school very accessible to a very diverse population. Of course, the cost of living in Newcastle is markedly lower than Sydney. I think it's about half the price, if not more, to buy a house and to rent, probably about half the price as well. So it actually becomes much more accessible if you're a student to consider living in Newcastle and not have the same high cost of living. And it also is a very easy to move around city, as Mary would have said. You can walk everywhere, very, very friendly and very supportive community. In fact, if I walk up the road to the shops, I know that I'm going to meet one of my law students behind the counter of just about every shop, and if it's not one of my law students, then it's one of the university students. Again, 76% of the graduating cohort first in family. I think I've covered many of those, so I won't touch on them. I think importantly the Indigenous Early Entry Scheme, which I introduced for the first time last year, it does quite a lot for Indigenous students, gives them guaranteed housing. We have a Wallatuka Institute which supports our Indigenous students. We give them a pre-law orientation, and then we have a mentoring program that exists for them. I think this is so important because we're not just interested in making sure that they come to us and supporting them in terms of their decision making, but we want to make sure that they succeed on the way through. And I've probably touched on these matters already. I had far too many slides, but really to point out that law schools can be quite different across Australia. Not all of them, in fact very few of them, run full clinical programs. Not all of them have free clinics. We have a number. We also run public interest cases and have run, in fact, a number of quite famous and well-known asylum seeker cases, as well as cases like the Cornelia Rao case. We were involved in the Azaria Chamberlain case. We're involved in the Ron Levy shooting, and we currently are involved in 2 large-scale environmental impact interest cases as well, which is fairly typical for us. We normally have at least 2 major public interest cases per year, sometimes more. So we're involved in a number of justice innocence projects which involve people who are incarcerated. So in terms of that, each year we provide a lot of legal advice. We open a lot of legal files, and we're actually quite active in terms of our work. Our students do love the programs like Law on the Beach, and that really shows how different you can be when you're living almost on a beach. And our students set up in the local surf club every January, February, and people literally come out of the water to seek legal advice. We have a number of initiatives that I think it's important to understand that a regional law school could do. I used to be at Monash, though. I was for 5 years the director of the Australian Centre for Justice Innovation, and I've had quite a lot of experience in big universities. But the difference in a small regional area is you can actually do such a lot, and it's terribly exciting to be there. So our major initiative at the moment, and we had a symposium with about 160 people last month, is to transform Newcastle into a restorative city. And that's important because it's actually about creating better cohesive relationships and really making it a safe and, I think, a very happy place to live. And I think it gels very nicely with Ahmet's Affinity theme because it's so related. It's about restoring and promoting, I think, strong and healthy relationships throughout the community. Our other work in terms of climate change, our focus on that is, of course, on displacement. Amy Maguire, who is part of our team, has done a lot of work on human rights, climate displacement. We have a whole team working on the impact of climate displacement and what will happen into the future. That's partly because we are the UNITAR training area in relation to climate change. We're very proud of our UN relationship in terms of training for climate change issues across the region. So the small size of our law school, small, 200, I think that's quite a good size. It's a little large almost, but it does actually mean that we build quite close relationships. And again, I really reject the notion that there isn't diversity amongst law schools and that they are somehow all homogeneous in terms of their input. And there I've given you a list of our current immersion programs to give you an idea about how they work. I think the Kenya law immersion experience has been a very positive one. It's been the result of an exchange between Kenya and my university for a number of years, and lots of positive benefits flowing out of that. So do contact me if you'd like any further questions. I think we've got time for discussion, and I hope I didn't speak for too long.
No.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.